Here na? Go? Okay, sige. So gandang hapon sa inyong lahat, and thank you for coming to attend the seminars, which is part of the MSI 50 seminar series by our faculty members. This afternoon, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rachel Ravagogotanco. Rachel graduated at UP Diliman MBB in 1995. And shortly after, we were fortunate that she joined us in a project, the very first project funded by DOST on developing DNA markers for commercially important aquatic organisms. And because of that, I think Rachel decided she would stay in the marine sciences. And so she took her MS in 1998 and finished in 2002 here at the Marine Science Institute. Subsequently, did her PhD starting in 2024 to 2010 under a GF PhD scholarship program. Unfortunately, she's decided to stay with the marine sciences. Rachel is now, after she finished her PhD in 2010, she got awarded as one of the outstanding marine scientists. And in 2011, MSI recruited her to become a faculty member. So Rachel is now a professor here at MSI and a molecular ecologist. Her research group at the Marine Molecular Ecology and Evolution Laboratory uses molecular methods to uncover genetic diversity, characterize the distribution of genetic variation, and infer ecological and evolutionary processes shaping the patterns for various marine organisms. Her research aims to generate information relevant to management and conservation of natural populations, as well as the development of genomics-based resources and tools for the sustainable utilization and improvement of cultured species. So without further ado, Rachel, please take the floor.
Thank you, Professor Menes, for the very nice introduction. So siguro some of you have been thinking, doing the mental math, graduated this, that. So one thing I share with MSI, pareho kaming since 1974. So that gives you an idea how old I am. So I'm 50. So this presentation, this seminar is also for me like somewhat of a journey. No? When I started, after I graduated, this was my first job. Dr. Menes was my first boss. I was an RA in her project with Dr. Monhe. And I guess this is also, yeah, I guess a journey because it was all, as I was making this presentation, it was also a way for me to reflect, no, on the field as well as some, I guess, personal milestones. So this afternoon, I'll be sharing with you a journey to explore biodiversity in the Philippine seas through the lens of molecular approaches. So looking at DNA, RNA, also proteins. So let's go straight to the point, no? So when we talk about, or when we think about biological diversity, we think diversity and distributions. So what you're seeing here is one of the very widely used images, no, to convey a message that this area of the world, I, uh, we are here, right? So this area of the world harbors the highest concentration of marine biodiversity. Okay, so this map tells us already two things. It tells us how much diversity, because you can see there a scale in terms of from less than 50 species of corals to 600. Okay, so that tells us, gives us an idea of how much. Okay, and it also gives us an idea of how it is distributed. Okay, so patterns of distribution. But one thing that we can infer from this map, obviously, is what is the significance of all that diversity? How does it work to an advantage to in terms of function of organisms, of communities, of ecosystems? And when we think about diversity and distributions, the next, I guess, logical question after we ask how much diversity and how it is distributed is what are the driving forces? What shape that pattern of this diversity that we see? Okay, and we know, and in the field of biogeography and phylogeography, we know that that pattern is shaped over evolutionary time, but there are also ecological processes at work. Okay, so I'm showing here a figure. When we talk about paleohistory, we think about a long, long time ago, before the configuration of the Philippine Islands is as it was now, right? So it was island integration reconstructions by Hall in 1998 and 2002 that shows us how the islands, came to be. So we were actually amalgamated from different parts of different plates. Okay, and I think it was 5 million years ago, 7 million years ago, that the Philippines, as we know it, looks as it is right now. But we also look at fairly recent history. So recent history meaning the last 1 million to 3 million years during the Pleistocene glaciations, when the configuration, while the topography or the arrangement of the islands was already in place, the basins, no, were fairly different because of sea level. Okay, so the Visayan Seas, for example, was not a sea back then because of the high sea level. Okay, and because of those Pleistocene glaciations, it was thought that this was actually an opportunity for speciation to occur because organisms were separated in space. Okay, there was no opportunity for them to interact and interbreed. But we also look at the influence of contemporary factors. So here we take ecological scale factors, working on time scales of days to weeks to months to years, maybe even decades. We look at temperature, we look at surface circulation occurrence, we look at habitat distribution, quality, we look at the biology of the organisms and many other um, biotic factors. So that is how we try to piece together how what were the evolutionary and ecological driving factors. So which brings me to, I guess, the thesis, no, or the key idea of this presentation, is that molecular approaches have actually revolutionized, how we look at and how we understand biological diversity. So this slide, I think, is 10 years old. I've been using this slide for the last 10 years to communicate my thoughts, about how I understand biological diversity and what, to my mind, are the key questions. So it has always been asking how much diversity. Okay, and we have the fields of or the tools of DNA barcoding, the fields of metagenomics and phylogenetics that give us an idea, and I will show you a few examples of that in the next few slides. So that gives us an idea of how much variation exists in populations, how many species there are, or genetic lineages there are in an ecosystem, right? And it also answers some questions about how diversity is distributed. So we can uncover patterns and we can deduce processes using the fields of phylogeography, for example, in population genetics, which looks at how genetic variation is distributed in space as well as how it changes through time. So we can infer population parameters, effective population sizes, were sizes constant, were they expanding, were they contracting, and we can look at uh, microevolutionary forces like gene flow, selection, and drift, and how they change allele frequencies. And the last question, the third question, is actually one of the more interesting questions right now, because with molecular tools, it gives us access to the black box of how organisms not only function, but how they respond to current conditions, as well as how they can potentially respond to um, future ocean or future environmental conditions. So we have the fields of all of these omics fields like transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, oh my God, which gives us an idea about how organisms work at those levels. We can predict, we can annotate, okay, and we can speculate on underlying molecular mechanisms, which are spawned by genetic variants, okay. So all of these things, answering all of these questions gives us an idea about not only diversity, but also its function in terms of adaptation, resilience, no? Not just of individuals and populations, but even of ecosystems. And if we have an idea of that, then that can be practically translated to more pressing questions of the day, particularly how we can manage, how we can conserve, how we can protect our marine resources. Okay, and this gives us guidelines, no, or guideposts for these kinds of interventions. So all of these actually have been really accelerated by developments in sequencing technologies. So the figure on the left shows how fast, no, advancements have contributed to us accumulating data, genetic data. So starting from techniques like the old electrophoresis and sequencing, where you had to cast your own gel and run it, and I think it was radiographic or X-ray for detection, right? All the way to even single cell sequencing that produced huge leaps, no, in our capability to generate data. And not only that, obviously our tools, the genomic toolbox, what tools we have at our disposal to interrogate the biological world have also evolved. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see this, but the essence of this figure is there are many ways to skin a cat. So there's a universe practically of molecular techniques, platforms, technologies, methods, okay, that you can use to interrogate the genome so that you can develop markers or you can characterize variation. You can also interrogate the complement of expressed genes or the transcriptome. You can even look at the epigenome. Okay. So this is an old map. This is more than 10 years old, but it lays a foundation for how the genomics toolbox has developed. So central to answering the first question, how much diversity? So we know that DNA encodes instructions, for life, but it also provides a record of natural history, and it is that knowledge that DNA can now be used as a natural system for classification. Okay, so this is phylogenetic tree uh, generated by Bose et al. In 1990, where they used genetic data. So DNA sequences, particularly of, I think this is the small subunit rRNA, okay, to generate what we call a tree of life, to classify organisms and to show who are more closely related to whom, who are more distantly related, based on differences in their sequences. It's not even genomes, it's just a small portion of the genome. And fast forward to, I think this is 2016. So this is the three domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota, based on genome sequences. Okay, so whole genome sequences. But instead of using the whole genome, they extracted, I think, several gene regions. Okay, so DNA also can be used as a practical tool. No, um, effectively, it can be used as a bookmarker, or ano ba, in Filipino, palatandaan, no? So it's a marker for diagnosing things. In this case, it's a marker for identifying uh, genetic lineages or taxa, and drawing, I guess, boundaries between these are just variants of a single species, but these are different species. Okay, so the advantage of um, DNA markers is not to supplement morphological techniques, no, but to complement morphological techniques, and to provide a tool, no, to differentiate units where morphology fails. So if you have, for example, something like this, like zooxanthellae, which are dinoflagellates, so they all look like that, right? So you can't tell them apart. You can't morphologically, it would be difficult to identify them to species level, but there is a huge diversity of species and genera in this Symbiotiniaceae. So in the 1990s, no, so Rowan and Knowlton developed an indirect method to interrogate DNA, without having to do sequencing, but doing basic, simple molecular biology tools, techniques of PCR and electrophoresis to diagnose, no, um, and assign these cells to species or variants. And another way that it can also be used is to clarify where morphology is ambiguous. I like to use this example of Echinometra, um, because the morphological characters here were just color of the spines. Okay, so this one was black, this one was white, this one was white and black. Are they s- ma- uh, different phenotypes of a single species, or are they different species? And using a phylogenetic approach with DNA as characters, that question was easily answered. Okay? So they turned out to be different species. So the field has advanced, no, such that DNA is now very broadly adapted, no, for species identification. So we actually have the enterprise of DNA barcoding. And what I'm showing here is a website of the Barcode of Life data systems. Perhaps many of you are familiar with this. No, it works like they have a library of sequences. You have an unknown, what species is this? No, I know this sequence, but I want to confirm that this is what I think it is. Then just plug it in, and it does a query. Okay, so um, so far this is a list of all the uh, taxonomic groups that they have records for, or they have references for, and it is a very useful reference, no, for species identification. But it's not to say that it has its limitations. So it has its promise, which is to standardize and to increase the scale of DNA-based identification. But the early criticisms, and still the prevailing criticism of DNA barcoding as a sole technique for species identification, is the idea that one gene fits all. So you can identify, you rely on For example, if it's animals, you use the cytochrome oxidase gene. If it's plants, you use the MATK or the RBCL genes in the chloroplast. If it's fungi, they rely on ITS. So for most of um, life, that might work, but for some taxa, that might be particularly challenging, especially those taxa that are just in the process of speciation. So the lineages have not sorted. They haven't accumulated fixed differences that can be diagnostic. Okay, so and then also technical issues in terms of the database. So the first one is completeness of the database. So your confidence in identifying or assigning your unknown to a box obviously will depend on how complete your information is in terms of your a priori knowledge on the query or the reference sequences. So that's one. And another one is, for example, cases of mistaken identity. So people who have expertise in taxonomy and systematics are, I think, rare nowadays. So it really is a very specialized field. And it's not uncommon to see even in the databases, no, inaccurate identifications or inaccurate taxonomy of reference sequences. And that will obviously propagate taxonomic errors through the literature. So I don't remember what decade it was where there was a debate, that dichotomy of molecules versus morphology. But I do remember that point. No, but now there is really I guess a pivot. No, to adopt a more integrated approach to taxonomy. And the term integrative taxonomy, as I found out while I was preparing this talk, was first coined in 2005 by, I don't know how to pronounce that, Deirat. But the idea here is you don't rely on morphology alone or molecules alone, but you rely on multiple lines of evidence and look for congruence. Okay, so this schematic was from the paper of Padial, where they proposed, I guess they call it the taxonomic circle representation of work protocol for species recognition. So it recognizes, for example, different lines of evidence. You can look at DNA, you can look at morphology, you can look at reproductive biology, ecology, geography, chemistry, whatever. And where two lines of evidence converge or are concordant, then you can draw a line there, and then your taxa can escape the circle, and they can be considered as possibly different species. Okay, so the more lines of evidence you have, I guess, uh, more confidence, right, in your delineation. And this actually fits in well with, I put this here, this what looks like a tuning fork, but this is actually a representation of the unified species concept. How do you define a species? How do you delineate species? So in this proposal by De Quiros, 2007, he puts forward the idea that the primary criteria for defining putative species is that they are separately evolving metapopulations of lineages or something like that. Yeah, separately evolving metapopulation lineage. So these two, right? So they're on different trajectories. But how can you tell that first? How can you tell that they're separately evolving, and how do you know that they're actually there, right? So that was the idea behind the unified species concept. So the more species secondary criteria you have, so whether it's if your primary criteria is DNA, if you have secondary criteria like another DNA marker, for example, or you know that there's asynchrony in reproduction, or you know that they occupy different habitats, then that can add up as secondary criteria. Okay, so applying all these, techniques, I guess one perspective about diversity in general and diversity in the marine environment from a molecular perspective is that cryptic species are very common. Okay, and it's simply because we now have more power and more resolution to diagnose them as such. Okay, so what are cryptic species? They're different species that are lumped as one simply because you can't tell them apart or you don't have uh, the tools to differentiate them. And this is actually not updated. If you have a sharp eye, you'll notice that the dates there end in 2006. So that's just the last time I ran this search. But the general idea is you have an increasing number of reports of cryptic species in the scientific literature. So this slide is here to remind me to emphasize on why it's important to have an accurate species identification because a lot of downstream um, uh, studies now rely on it. So improper classification confounds or characterization of biology, ecology, and even evolutionary history. Um, Accurate classification is needed to quantify diversity and distribution, so the fields of biogeography and population genetics, and the more applied pragmatic fields of conservation and management of biodiversity obviously relies on having these two things being correct. Okay. So in the next few slides, I'll just give you a few examples of cryptic species that we've been fortunate enough to work on in the lab. So one is coral, no? So Posilopora. Um, so it's Posilopora damicornis sensolato following Veron and Pichon. And you can see that there's very wide diversity of morphological forms, right? So I think these four were selected by Andrew because the student who worked on this study, because they typify the P. damicornis ecomorphs first described by Veron and Pichon. But recently, no, 10 years ago, the taxonomy of these ecomorphs have been revised based on an integrative approach, morphology and genetic data by Schmidt and Roach. So what was previously called as the Poecilopolar damicornis species complex is now a group of, I think, five different lineages. Okay. And applying those um, I guess, reference sequence data and using them to look at our own um, collections here. Okay, what we now know is we actually don't have Posilopora damicornis, but what we do have is Posilopora acuta, Posilopora verrucosa as the primary Posiloporids, but we also have other taxa like Brevicornis, Meandrina, Eduxi. Okay, so the main point here is that morphological variation can be challenging. It can be very wide and it can be challenging to identify. So I don't know if you can see here. So this is a grid of Poeciloporid photos. Okay, so these first two rows were identified based on molecular tools as being Poecilopora acuta. This row is Poecilopora verrucosa. So the same colored box just shows colonies that look very similar. They're actually different species. So this one, okay, and then also this one. Okay. So aside from clarifying the identification, it also helped us to contribute to revisiting the distribution. Okay. So we now have a map of distributions of these Poeciloporids from different places in the Philippines. Another one that we recently worked on, um, sa taxa of sea cucumbers, ano ba yung name na dragonfish, no? So, or the warty sea cucumber. So, it's, we put the name there as Ticopus cf horrens, also because we were not sure of the taxonomy, so we're being careful. But what we know about this group is that it's actually composed of different, at least two different species. So we call them. We use the term pseudocryptic now because in hindsight, um, or Dr. Menezes' hindsight, that there are actually diagnosable morphological differences. But when we were just starting to look at these animals early on, we couldn't tell them apart. So, but what molecular markers reveal is that it reveals that there are actually two different species. That taxonomy is also not resolved. So for now, we're calling them Psychopus cf horrens clade A and clade B, okay, because this has to be worked on by a taxonomic specialist, of which I am not. So, and we also suspect additional lineages. And similar to the Poecilopora damicornis acuta example, using these tools to diagnose or to differentiate now gives us a handle to look at their distributions. So we can have initial data on their distributions range-wide, meaning across the Indo-Pacific, using data that's already publicly available in the public databases like GenBank. Okay, and we can take a closer look at their distributions in the Philippines. So this is quite a handy tool do to facilitate uh, assessments of biodiversity. The last one last example for cryptic species. So if you're familiar with blue coral, so currently called Heliopora cerulea. Okay, but back in I think beginning in 2014, they already showed initial evidence of these being two different species, which matches their morphology. So we have the uh, columnar or the submassive morphotype, and then the laminar or the plate-like morphotypes. So this was shown or suggested back in 2014 to be already different species based on allozyme markers, so protein markers. And recent studies, I think in 2019 and 2021, also used more sophisticated markers, like DNA and even single nucleotide polymorphisms. So in a recent study that's still unpublished, so we used high throughput sequencing to interrogate the genomes of these two morphs. And after SNP discovery, we were able to come up with 1,610 loci. And using those as characters, these actually reveal that we have two lineages that match the morphotype. So the blue one is here is the columnar morphotype, and the red one, I think, or the orange one is the laminar. Okay. But what we're also more excited about with this one is not just looking at their distributions, right? But because we have a large number of markers that we can query against sequence databases, or what we call functional annotation, we are now able to look at if these markers that diagnose the two species map to any associated functions. Okay, and we found several loci that actually map to genes that are inferred. No, the word is inferred to be associated with morphology, reproductive processes, even timing of reproduction and receptor recognition, as well as stress response. So this is an interesting way to illustrate how having more markers, no, interrogated from nearly the whole genome. Okay, I say nearly because we did not do genome sequencing. Can give us more insight, no, not just into patterns, but into underlying mechanisms. In this case, which may be driving speciation of these two blue coral. So they're now called Heliopora sp for the columnar morph and Heliopora cerulea for the laminar morph. But these are provisional names. No? And as of 2021, the paper says pending formal taxonomic revision. So I guess it also to highlight the point that taxonomic revision takes quite a while. So I think yun. And it really needs uh, specialists and experts to go through that process. Okay, so the next frontier, no? So DNA barcoding is routine, diba? Even metabarcoding is routine. I guess the next frontier for biodiversity assessments using molecular tools is environmental DNA metabarcoding, and it involves profiling and detecting all the extractable DNA from an environmental sample. So that can be water, that can be soil. For terrestrial organisms, it can be scat, right, or droppings. It can even be air, okay, for pollen, okay. So, and profiling, identifying what species are there, similar to the idea of barcoding. But what's in my sample? Sequence the heck out of it and blast it against reference databases, and you'll get a plot that tells you these are what's in your sample and their relative abundances. So just to give you an idea of the how the technique works. Okay, but again, like barcoding, it also has its applications and challenges. But this is a rapidly growing field. No, there are many. There's even several journals dedicated to environmental DNA only, okay? Because it's in the field, it's in a stage where the protocols and the methodologies are still being refined, developed, polished, what have you, okay? And but it has a lot of promise, no, for species detection, mapping species distribution, by monitoring, okay? So I think I've spent more time that I want than I wanted on the question of how much species. So beyond biodiversity assessments, no, beyond I guess beyond counting the number of species, is looking at patterns and process. And here we have the field of phylogeography and population genetics. Okay, so we look at the geographic distribution of genetic lineages. So a little bit of, I guess, not ancient history. So this is 22 years old. But this is one of the dominant patterns, no, that you will see in marine biogeography, the Indo-West Pacific break. And around this time, okay, there were, I guess, there were really a lot of studies, no, that tried to explore this pattern using different taxa, no. So insert your favorite organism here and see if you can get that plot. So that kind of activity. Fast forward to 2019, no, there's still some study on, still an active area of research, but instead looking at more species or comparative phylogeography and more markers. So this is the latest that I could find about phylogeographic breaks across the Indo-West Pacific. So the idea here is you can actually, again, mining the DNA sequence for as much information as you can, right? About the timing and the sequence of divergence, population size changes through time, even population parameters. It can tell you effective population sizes. Okay? It can tell you, give you estimators of genetic diversity. Okay, and for also more important, you can look at spatial patterns of differentiation. So we can, I guess I always keep saying this, our preoccupation is to draw lines in the water to delineate populations and boundaries, and even arrows drawing connections between those populations. Okay, so we now have population genetics, now called population genomics, if you're using high throughput sequencing approaches. So instead of using, let's say, 10 or 15 or 50 microsatellite markers, we're now using thousands of single nucleotide polymorphism. So that's a huge amount of data. Okay, but what is the advantage of doing that? So our estimates now are genome wide, no, and it actually has unprecedented. I keep saying the word unprecedented power and resolution, no, for detecting differences. Okay, we can now even more confidently detect hybridization or introgression, and we can now explore adaptive variation, whereas in the old population genetic markers, uh, it was difficult to detect adaptive variation because there were really very few markers that we're using. And because of this, we can now jump over to functional significance. Now we can ask, what is the importance of having this variant on the phenotype, no, or on the function of an organism? Okay, so I'll spend, I guess, the next few minutes talking about specific examples, no, of how um, population genetics uh, and molecular tools have been used to interrogate patterns of differentiation in the marine environment. So, sea cucumber, also known as sandfish, Holothurius cabra. Okay, sorry, I did not put a picture. But when we looked at uh, genetic patterns, no, of samples collected all over the archipelago, so from uh, Cagayan all the way to Tawi-Tawi and in between. Okay. And this was using just a few microsatellite markers, 11. Okay. We were able to identify or to delineate um, populations which are genetically distinct and likely do not have much gene flow between them. Okay, and they actually fit in nicely with the marine biogeographic regions uh, of the Philippines, delineated by these red lines. No? So you have the West Philippine Sea, you have the North Philippine Sea, South Philippine Sea, the internal seas, and the Sulu and Celebes seas. Okay, so and we can actually also estimate, no, patterns of gene flow between them. So we can draw all these migration networks and maps to visualize, no, um, how these populations, no, same color means they're the same genetic population, different colors, obviously, magkaiba sila, how they are actually connected. No? So it's, again, drawing lines in the water for boundaries and connections. Okay? And using more advanced methods to answer the same question. No? So we did high throughput sequencing. Instead of using 11 microsatellite loci, we now had we had 8,000 SNP loci, no, to play with. So it actually recovers similar patterns as the microsatellite loci, where you have the populations segregated or grouping by biogeographic region. But there are, of course, some differences, like SNPs provide higher resolution. So there are some populations here, for example, in the central Philippines, that could not be differentiated or segregated by microsatellite loci, but they could by SNP loci. Okay. we can also estimate effective population sizes. So this small short paper actually showed that effective population sizes of hatchery-produced animals is much, much lower than the population size of wild animals or natural populations. So I think this is 19 against 1,000 or more in terms of the effective population size. And that has obvious consequences to um, uh, strategies for management. Okay? So another example, again, corals. No? So when we looked at broad scale sampling, obviously we see very discrete populations no, across large distances because these are fairly limited in terms of their dispersal. So they're sessile diba, organisms, but they have a dispersive phase as larvae. Okay, so I think it's 2 to 3 weeks for the species, and that is their only opportunity to disperse and expand their genetic neighborhoods, right? So with broad scale sampling, we see actually that uh, populations from the North Philippine Sea, Cagayan here, Calayan Island group here, are actually very different from the rest of the archipelago. Okay, but if you take a closer look here, we can also see some differences there. So, for example, the West Palawan populations are different from Bolinao and the Verde Island. Sulu is also very different from the others. Okay, so it's that kind of pattern seeking studies, right? But this will also have obvious implications to our inferences on how populations can be maintained or how they can persist, especially in the face of environmental change or habitat degradation. Okay, in looking at the KIG and the West Palawan, for example, we see here that when we ordinate the genotypes, they actually again match their geographical locations. So we have the KIG uh, Fossilopora here from Pag-asa and from Sabina, and they're actually apparently panmictic. No? So there's no differentiation between these two, even though they're pretty far apart. And then we have the rest of the West Palawan populations and I think this is Tubataha. Okay. We also did some studies on the Verde Island Passage. Again, just an example to how we try to delineate populations and draw lines in the water. Okay. But when we look at fine scales, no, studying these genetic distributions at finer scales gives us a window not just into evolutionary mechanisms, but more ecology within the lifetime of an organism. So looking at these colonies in the Bolinao Anda Reef Complex, so it's just this area. So I think this is no more than 50 kilometers distance from one to the other. No? Um, and a student actually did exhaustive sampling of 10 by 40 meter area here. Okay. And what he found was that clonality, no, or the presence of clones, no, might actually be related to wave exposure. So in areas where you have higher wave energies, like here in Lucero and Malilnep, the colonies are actually, there are fewer colonies and they're actually smaller. And there's actually a greater contribution of sexual reproduction. So they're more sexually, mode of reproduction is more sexual. Whereas here, where you have lower wave energies in Kamaluyan and Kanyogan, you obviously have more colonies and they're actually also bigger in size, but more of them are actually clones. Okay. And that gives us some insight about how these animals um, respond to environmental cues. This example on mud crabs, I put this here because apart from looking at patterns of differentiation based on neutral loci, we are now able to look at loci that might be influenced by selection. Okay. So Sila Olivaceae and the Seleuci, so these are the sampling sites. Okay. When we look only at neutral loci, so this is a study that used 1,631 SNPs. So looking only at neutral loci, meaning those that are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and are likely not under the influence of selection, we see that there's very weak gene flow. No? So there's no discernible pattern of differentiation. But what we can infer also is that there's some westward dispersal, okay, which fits in well with what we know about surface circulation in the area. But when we look at outlier loci, I think this is just a small number, less than 50 SNPs that were detected to be likely under selection. We see a very different pattern of differentiation. So we actually see a latitudinal climb. So the dark areas here represent higher probabilities of membership in that cluster. So we actually have 4 clusters, north through south. Okay, and these are actually putatively associated with I can see my own slides with sea surface temperature. Okay, so this might be giving us a clue as to that there's selection going on even at these very few loci, and that will be impacting the population structure of these animals if we just look at those loci. Last last example for adaptive divergence. So this was also a recent paper on Sardinella galunggong, studied in the northern Mindanao coast. So I'm not sure. So I guess the people on Zoom can see this clearly. This is the northern Mindanao coast. Ay, sorry. And there are 2 regions: the northern Mindanao region and then the um, uh, NZP. I forget what that stands for. But when we look at neutral loci, we don't see any differentiation. They're just one big population. But looking at outlier loci and even just 31 outlier loci, it cleanly separates these 2 regions, the NMR and then the NZP. And Kevin hypothesized that these may be linked to adaptations to environmental conditions, for example, which are different between those 2 regions: sea surface temperature, chlorophyll, organic content, right? And when we look at their allele frequency differences, we can see that there are actually some differences in allele frequencies between populations in these 2 regions. Okay. So by this point, I'm thinking you're sick of looking at maps. But I just to drive home the point, no, that with advancements in sequencing and high throughput sequencing, we are able to look at many loci. We can tease apart neutral variation from adaptive variation, and we can actually run with that in terms of our hypothesis on what is actually influencing these adaptive loci. Okay, you can link it to environment, you can link it to other biotic factors. Okay, so it's a very open field. So the last part of this talk, no, I guess, is to ask the question, diba, why are we doing all of these, diba? Para saan? But what for, aside from the basic science and the joy of the joy of discovery, no? What's a practical approach, no? Or the practical application or the pragmatic use of these, no? So these are actually very important for management and conservation planning, and also for taking this information, no, and bringing it to practical approaches for development and increased productivity of these biological resources. So what do I mean? No? So the information in the maps conveyed by those, like defining units and the connections between them, and how they can be maintained or anong significance sila, no? In the maintenance, persistence, adaptation, resilience of these populations. These are all important guideposts, no, that can be used to support management and conservation planning. So the very first one is identifying management units. Diba? How can you manage something if you don't know which units you're going to be managing? So that's the first contribution of population genetics approaches. No? Putting things in boxes. No? This is population A or unit A, which is should be differently managed from unit B, etc. Okay. And the second one is, once you know that, diba, how do we prioritize? No, because resource limitations, obviously, you cannot really manage everything. So you have to pick the best spots or the strategic areas for management. And this is important is specifically for area-based management interventions, also for stock enhancement or for restoration, and also managing for resilience and adaptive potential. This one is actually fairly, I wouldn't say recent, but in the last decade, you know. So the emphasis on managing for adaptive potential, and this is actually more put to the fore, no, in this era of a changing global climate. Okay? And this is an old schematic, no, circa 2003, which helps to visualize, no, how do you decide which ones are which populations to prioritize, and it's based on a balance of whether they're adaptively divergent, okay, or they're geographically isolated. So for example, populations that are very different because they are highly adapted to a particular location, okay, um, they can be, or populations that are very different, sorry, simply because of drift by chance, no? Or isolation, okay? They are distinct population units that might deserve designation as being of conservation concern. Okay? In contrast, yan, yung mga nandito, where you have populations that have a high rate of exchange, they have a lot of connections with a lot of other populations, and they're not very different, no? They're not divergent. So they're not special in that sense. Then they can be low conservation priority. And I found this very nice schematic, no? Fairly new, just last year, a proposal for considerations for designating management units and evolutionarily significant units. So it's like a checklist. No, step one, think of their origin. So is it invasive? Then likely not meriting uh, CU or ESU status. But if they're native, yes. Okay. Is that population undergoing in decline or exhibiting uh, signatures of low effective population size? For example, what is that threshold? The number is NE less than 1,000, but it can also go NE less than 500. Okay. If yes, then go to step 3. If no, then park that population. Step 3, is it undergoing differentiation because of drift or isolation? Okay. So if it's yes, if it's an isolated population, then it may warrant management status. Okay. But if it's a panmictic population, it can still be considered for management concern if it exhibits differentiation by selection. Okay, so if it exhibits signals of local adaptation being uh, marked as special because it's adapted to its environment, then it can be considered for CU or ESU status. Okay, so I think this is a fairly simple way, you know, to consider to think about these units and how they're designated. So the second one, no, second one, what for? So obviously for economic purposes, no, and then for the benefit of humanity, or the term that I came across was nature's contributions to people, NCP. I came across that term. So you can actually use that information. That information is a wealth, is a treasure trove, no, of discovery when you're thinking about practical applications of biotechnology, medicine, etc. Okay, so for this afternoon, I just wanted to focus on how it can be used to improve aquaculture. Okay, so aquaculture genomics is a field, no, that is dedicated to using genomic resources to guide selection, uh, broodstock development, and improvement. Um, so aquaculture is the fastest growing farm food sector, and this plot actually shows this image, no, shows farm species with an annual production value of greater than US 1 billion. So dito sa dulo, just a few. These are livestock, so cows, chickens, pork, and everything here is aquatic. Um, so you might recognize yon, some of your favorite food here. May bangus, merong alimango. There's also sea cucumbers here. Okay. And in terms of production, no, global production by sector and by continent, you can see here Asia in terms of value in million US dollars. No? Far outpacing all the other regions, no, in terms of aquaculture for crustaceans, echinoderms, mollusks, and finfish. Okay? So it's really a very valuable industry. Okay, and this shows, I guess, how I like to think of it in terms of progress, no, to using genomic resources. You can use it for selecting broodstock, for example, profiling your natural populations. So these, I want to pick this because of this reason. They are more resistant to disease. They are more temperature tolerant. You have your checklist. And then you also need to manage that population, managing for genetic diversity to make sure that the pool of diversity is uh, is maintained or even enriched. Okay, and then the last step is actually broodstock improvement, and this is where we now take what we know about the genetic architecture of production traits. No? So what do we know, for example, about these fast-growing sea cucumbers or these fast-growing bangus? No? What do we know about them at the level of the genes and genomes, and how can we use that to improve them, no, and use that for improving the broodstock. So we have techniques on genomic selection. Instead of waiting for these animals to mature, you can now actually genotype them and predict, okay, these ones will most likely be fast growing, most likely be having these traits just by looking at their genomes. Um, we've done some work on that for the sandfish, very basic work, looking at the differences between these small, slow-growing sandfish juveniles versus the large-growing juveniles, and look at their RNA, so gene expression. And we're able to see that there are actually some differentially expressed genes that are involved in growth differences. Last one, aside from applications to improvement, there are other industry applications that these markers can be used for. So they can be used for genetic traceability. So for example, in some European Union regions, they now uh, they now ask for parang certification or proof of uh, this is the correct species, this comes from this area that's sustainably managed, etc. So eco-certification programs. So in this same concept now, you can actually use markers to trace populations to their population of origin. In this case, a student was able to mine the transcriptome sequences and identified 88 SNPs that can be used to assign sandfish juveniles to areas where they were actually collected. So, last three slides. No, so this is the portion where I think I reflect on the challenges. No, so I've been talking a lot about the advantages. Diba? This is very good. This is very pioneering. This is very useful for many practical aspects. No? But there's still obviously some challenges, and I could think of two. No? So the first one is that the adoption of molecular techniques to biodiversity research, while it is increasing, no, there's actually a rush of, oh, okay, let's do DNA, let's do genomics, right? But it's still fairly limited in terms of the proportion of researchers who are doing this kind of work. And the second most important challenge is that the incorporation of genetic data to its practical application of management and conservation remains very limited. Okay, and there exists really a disconnect between the science, okay, and how it is translated or not actually to practice and policy. So the gap is still wide. So, and this is true not only for developing countries like the Philippines, but even for um, uh, developed countries which have a very good culture of science and conservation practice. Okay, so just some thoughts now how to move this forward. Something I thought about. I think just this morning. when I finish this slide, no. So how do we I guess address those challenges? No? How do we uh increase no the adoption of these tools for biodiversity assessment and all the other practical applications? The first one is actually we need to build and enhance capability. So by capability, I mean not just infrastructure, not just the field and the lab facilities, not just the computing facilities. More importantly, the human resource, no? The warm bodies who will sit at those sit in those labs, look in front of those computers. No? So the young people like you who will continue to drive this field forward. So it starts with so this is the arena actually of researchers, diba? So this is what we like to do. You know? We like to think of questions, hypothesis. We like to go out and get the data, collect our samples. We like to do lab work and generate the data. Okay, we like to do analysis, right? And we end up here, right? Interpretation and insight. Okay. I guess, but what is siguro not for maybe for some scientists, no, they are more familiar with or more engaged with communicating their science and engaging with going outside their labs or their comfort zones and engaging with the broader community. So whether it's, for example, industry partners, right, or local government agencies, yung mga nagmo-monitor ng biodiversity, etc. No, it's really, I guess, a responsibility, no, to take that insight, diba, and communicate that. So this is the part where we actually have the a disconnect, right? So maybe we can do better, you know. And that comes from actually my personal reflection. No? And if we have that, no, if we have a communication between researchers, no, yung people who have the technical expertise, who know and worked on these data, and have a conversation no, with other people outside the research agenda, then that is how we can make the gap between um, uh, big data and results to application, practice, and policy. And I also put an arrow here because yun, hindi naman siya one way. It's not a one-way street. It's really an iterative process. No, it's only in having a broader view, no, of or a perspective of what other fields need, no, what other people need, is how we can refine this scientific enterprise. No? So these are very general, no? Very general. Hindi na ako naglagay ng mga specific except for these few. Except for just a very few specific things, no? To leapfrog, nangyari? Sorry. Diba? To leapfrog this, I think we need to ensure mechanisms for accessibility, no? Inuna ko nandiyan yung, sorry, permit application process. No, it has to be in not only accessible but hopefully no adaptive and responsive to the times, and I guess making an emphasis no on in terms of facilities. No, we also need to push for long-term storage and availability of samples, data, and metadata. So think museums, think repositories of research collections, because that actually holds a wealth of untapped information. Okay? Goes without saying, no, laboratory facilities, equipment, computing resources, all of these things, no, building the ecosystem to support your research, and not to mention, not to forget, obviously, investing in people, no, making sure that we continue to train, continue to encourage people, to pursue uh, scientific fields. We continue to um, enable them no, to do their best work, okay, by providing them with resources no, to make it possible. So I think these are just some thoughts on how we can move this forward. And this is also coming from to end no, from someone like me who started working on. I started in this field using the oldest of the old markers, which was allozyme. I don't know if anyone here knows that. So we used to work at that, Dr. Menyes, when I graduated at my first APAC here in MSI. Let's do allozyme markers. Okay. It never ceases to amaze me how the field has advanced, how far it has come, and how fast no the advancements came. And I guess the future looks bright, no, not just for this whole technical thing and this whole conceptual thing, but I guess yun, looking at this room filled with young people, ang daming bata dito. Puro, the demographic here is a lot of young people, no. So, yun, if um, I'm optimistic that if more of you, no, uh, join the scientific enterprise, go into science or even science communication, then we can continue to we can keep up, no, with the rest of the world in terms of this field. We can contribute, no, and we can find ways to utilize, no, these technologies, these developments, and translate it into something that uh, benefits people, no? Benefits the planet. So with that, yan. Thank you. There should be a lot more of logos because there are really a lot of institutions who funded this research and provided other support, and obviously uh, my lab, past and present students, no? So they put their contributions to this work are very significant. So, your young people's contributions are, don't think that diba? Parang don't be too intimidated. Just try it, diba? Who knows, you might like it. And with that, I'm open to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. So I hope all these wide-eyed youngsters are fascinated with the prospects of molecular ecology and its applications. So any questions from the audience first? And if somebody's looking at the Zoom, please let me know. Ano? Don't be shy. Yes, please.
Hi, Raja. My question is, for rather PCA and a mixture plot. So when we look at the PCA, they look like discrete populations, but then the mixture plots they look more continuous. So my question is, it's better that they're more continuous than discrete populations, right? So in addition to the pictures, and really manually genetically exchange relations such that we have more diverse and population and in relation to that as well uh related to so I do a lot of field assessments of biodiversity and and then I can pseudo cryptic species that are not practical field biologists because what they look are these morphological characters. So I just saw the um, uh, field biology in the future and lean more towards eDNA as opposed to like the standard way of looking at biodiversity. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. A lot of interesting questions. So first question about PCA plots versus admixture plots. No, so these are different ways, I guess, of analyzing data. So because when we look at when we do PCA plots, we're essentially looking at translating the differences into distances, no, and then making those distances into an ordination plot. No, so what we're seeing there is on average like um, similarities or dissimilarities. Looking at mixture plots is actually very interesting because what you're looking at there is the makeup of each individual, and you get to decide. For example, when you do an mixture plot in population genetics, you actually get to decide how many genetic clusters, you know, you hypothesize. So, for example, I know that there are two species. There are likely two species. So when I do an admixture analysis, I input there k is equal to 2. And I want to see how these how my genotypes the genotypes of my sample segregate, you know, into those species based on their individual uh, ancestry coefficients into uh, either cluster 1 or cluster 2. So that's how admixture plots are generated, and they provide very interesting information that may add on to your PCA plots. So I hope that answered the first question. And you actually also see hybrids, for example, more clearly when you do admixture. The second question was genetic exchange in the railway. Okay. So this is a question I get often, no? So, well, is it okay to, for example, we know we have an organism of management or conservation concern, good intentioned efforts, no, to okay, this population madami dito, lagyan natin doon sa lugar na wala. So that might be, I guess, dangerous in a genetic sense, because you don't, unless you have an idea of um, uh, whether those populations are actually represent, those different sites represent a single population, or they might be different populations that are either isolated or adapted, diba? So that is actually the main application, no, of using all of these, drawing these maps and those connections between them, is to guide translocation restoration and translocation efforts. And it even also works for stock enhancement using cultured animals, no? So while it might be good to think na, okay, I have a lot, I can propagate these in the hatchery, so I'll just use them and put them somewhere else. So it needs careful consideration. So the third question was, sorry, Oh, eDNA versus the standard way of it has its I guess advantages and it uh limitations, but I guess what will determine uh its use on a case to case basis is what the question is. No? eDNA is very attractive because it's rapid, bulk eDNA assessments. It's like results in a flash. I say in a flash, but it's really not. And you have really bulk, no? Community assessment. So you can say, oh, we have this much of this species here, so little of these species here, etc. And you can look at it at trends. And it's also very tractable in terms of logistically, no? So even kahit timbanan ano eh, kuha ka ng ano, pail and get a sample, that's already acceptable as eDNA. And it's actually like very tractable for citizen science. No? So there's I just read recently na um, there's a push no, to promote citizen science for environmental DNA monitoring. So that's well and good, but it depends on if that will be of value for you or for your question, right? But in some cases, for example, where you want really more targeted work, for example, eDNA might not be the best method. So it really depends on what your question is and what you're looking for.
Okay, anybody else? Comment? Yes.
Hello, Manish. My question is more on the application side of genomics. So you mentioned earlier about stock selection in using genomics for stock enhancement. So my question is, would the usage of genomic tools be more favorable, or would it in terms of the cost? Because we all know, although it's getting more or less expensive, but it's still expensive, especially. So would it outweigh the benefits, for example, for aquaculture businesses that uses genomic tools to enhance their, let's say, production?
So that's also an interesting question, a very in terms of pragmatic, no approaches, and we can go on all afternoon, just like exploring them. But the short answer there is, um, where your resources can allow you to do genomics work, right? Then that would be a very good approach. Why? Because of the sheer number of the sheer amount of information that you can get out of using high throughput sequencing. The cost is daunting, yes. Parang ano, it's really one time big time thing, no? So you pay this much, but you also get much more. In contrast to, for example, using more traditional single marker approaches, it may not cost you a lot in terms of initial capitalization, but it will cost you in time, in your time and in the amount of information that you can wrangle out of that data set. So if your resources, no, and if you have the facilities, if you have the expertise, no, the background, then by all means you can. It's good to do genomics level work. But that's not saying that if you are resource limited, then there's no hope, no? Um, yun, very basic markers can also do the job, no? It really just depends on what your question is. For example, if it's just species identification, yeah, it's really overkill to do maybe a SNP panel, no, or very expensive, um, high expertise needed. methods when very basic methods like indirect assays, etc., or a few number of markers will also work well. So I guess that's my perspective on it.
Okay. Meron pang questions? Anything in the Zoom? Yes, can you, yeah, please read. We'll take a question from the Zoom first.
Hi, ma'am. So there are five questions from Zoom. The first one is from Jerry Cotrillo. How is research ethics impacting and discovery of new species? I come to remember the bone wars between just Othniel Marsh versus Edward Cope during the 1870s, in which both rival paleontologists are naming similar species with little taxonomical evidence. How can molecular approaches to biodiversity preserve the integrity of research endeavors on the discovery of species?
That's a nice question, but it's really outside my purview in terms of that. I really have no taxonomy expertise. So if I can also put it forward to
Here, you wanna, yeah?
But I will not charge na.
Balik ko na lang po.
Thank you. So yung question was yung ethics of naming species, especially pag may mga nagko-compete na research groups, tama ba? Something like that. Drawing analogies of animals. So, ethics, maraming scientific fields na there are some very competitive people. It's a fact of life. And there are fields na talagang nag-uunahan na. And it can lead to, sometimes competition is a good thing, diba? It keeps you on your toes. But sometimes it leads people to take too much shortcuts, and including some egregious examples I've seen is parang DNA pa lang or picture lang of species, parang sila yung mauna. That has happened. It makes things fast, pero by doing it the quick way, we're losing a lot of the quality. However, I'd say na kasi that's like specialist groups, di ba? There would be groups of herpetologists, there would be groups of paleontologists, ganyan. I'd say overall, kami ni Rachel, we're both working on marine invertebrates. It's generally not like that. Actually, most people who do the molecular ecology work, like Rachel, will be like, oh no, I'm not a taxonomist. I'm just saying there are differences, but I'm not gonna name it. Like everyone's just actually avoiding the naming part because it's not. So parang medyo opposite nga yung problema pagdating sa marine inverts na pwede ba bigyan nila ng pangalan? So yun yung take ko specific for marine inverts. And ayun, more generally, ethical questions, again, we could spend all afternoon on that. Hope that helps.
Thank you, ma'am. For the second question po, it's from Enzo Halasan. Hi, Doc. For H. scabra, what's the possible reason why both of the Palawan populations, El Nido versus Coron, differed in the microsatellites, despite being geographically close and facing similar water bodies? Thank you.
That was also my question when I first saw the data, no? And so that first popped out when we used microsatellites, and the fact that it also emerged even when we used SNPs, na thousands of SNPs, we still see that differentiation where those two Palawan populations are very different actually from the rest of the archipelago. So for one, we know that it's a signal, that seems to be biologically real. So the questions there are, it can be, we can ask, is it selection, or is it just because they're very isolated populations? Because these are in very highly embayed areas, no? So there might not be a lot of dispersal going out or into those populations. So this is where we do let's think of storytelling, speculating. You have a checklist of this, oh no, or maybe this. It depends on the supporting evidence. So, but for now, that's what we're looking at. It's either because they might be locally adapted or because they're isolated because of genetic drift.
Yeah, so maybe just a general mention on about structures, no? Not too long ago when we started this, everybody was talking about everything to be panmictic. Halo-halo sila, the whole in. And then you start looking at finer scales. In fact, Rachel, the very first paper we published in Palawan almost didn't get published because there's impossible. You have very fine scale structuring. And we already had structuring north, south, east, and west. So it's very consistent yung Palawan, no? Even the RFLP markers pa lang. So there are some fine scale structuring, no? And that's what's fascinating in the Philippines. Yun yun. No? So it's in the same biogeographic area, but it's really relative. Not only dispersal, kasi sometimes you also think, dispersal potential, diba? Malaki naman, no? But it's really not just that, right? It's really recruitment success. So kung wala yung habitat na tama, miski dispersive option siya, hindi siya so iba yung dynamics, both the benthic and the pelagic. So Palawan, Coron is very interesting, no? Pero iba talaga siya doon sa mainland, both the Sulu Seaside and the West Philippine Seaside. Any other questions here? Yes.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Isaiah Lee. Thanks for the insightful talk. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the future of using specific molecular markers, for example, DNA barcodes, to study local species, considering that WGS is continuously getting cheaper. Do you think they'll be obsolete within our lifetimes, or will there still be important use cases for them?
I think there will always be use cases for those single markers, no, for the very reason that resources are limited, no, and if that can answer the question, but if you can use that and that can answer your question reliably and you have high confidence, then by all means, no, use that. So I don't think it's something that will be kumbaga outmoded.
Obsolete within their lifetime.
Obsolete. Maybe I guess the technologies for will be but the idea of using that, I think it's something that will be persistent.
There's another po from Zoom. It's from Jerry Cascon. Hello, I just want to ask suggestions for this. I have a strong background in marine ecology and biology, and I've recently developed an interest in molecular approaches within these fields. This webinar seems very timely, but I do have limited background in molecular biology. Could you suggest a starting point for me to begin exploring this area?
Okay. There is let's see. Okay. The short answer there would be there are a lot of resources available for getting background, no? So that would be a good starting point to read, right? But it's also very important to reach out to people who are working in the field. If this is something that you really would like to explore, then we are always welcome to help people out, no? So that's how that's how it really is, diba? So you try to keep training people, keep introducing people to these ideas, no? Because you'll never know, you might get have someone who has the drive, who has the capability to do independent research and just simply to run away with a question or a hypothesis.
Yeah. Any more there? So any questions from the audience? Before I get go ahead. Follow up.
Hello again, Ma'am Marisha.
Yes.
So I just have a curious questions since I might have missed the explanation earlier on. You were comparing one of your slides, you were comparing between neutral markers and markers that were under selection. And although my background in MolEco is not so strong, I'm just curious why or what was the question that made you use the markers that were under selection? Because under normally I think in PopGen we use the neutral markers since these are less fast evolving genes. Yeah, so yun.
Okay. So the short answer to that is, yeah, why differentiate between neutral markers versus markers that are likely under selection? Well, neutral markers can tell you a lot about gene flow, gene flow without selection. So it can tell you about how populations are exchanging individuals, the magnitude of that exchange, the patterns. That is not colored by potential signals of selection. So, for example, if you're using neutral markers and you see that two populations are distinct, you can rule out that they are distinct because one is under selection and the other is not. Okay, you know that the driving force there is either is likely drift in the absence of gene flow. Okay, so it's like parang eliminating possible causes. The interest in using outlier loci, and this was really a eureka moment when I was reading many years ago about the potential for SNPs, no, high throughput sequencing, to recover loci that are outliers, their selection, because this opens a whole new window to answering the question, then why are they different? Ba? Is it just because uh, they have been isolated for so long that they're very different, or is there something um, in the function? No? Maybe they respond differently to stress? Do they respond differently to different cues? So that is actually the beauty of using outlier loci. It can narrow down, bring you to the regions of the genome that are actually driving that divergence. And this is a uh, um, very interesting area when you do population genetics.
So Rish, can I follow through that? So especially when you don't have complete separation, diba? When you have a lot of samples that are really not yet quite differentiated. Is that also helpful to look at that? Kasi, diba, it tells you which one is driving, like your fork. So
Yes.
it's a good way to explore because things are not yet fixed, right? Everything is in a process. So it gives you that lens to see things that are changing very rapidly. So yung adaptive value niya. So that's the way I think about it. Here your benchmarks, conserved siya, evolutionarily long. But if you have something that's like your rare alleles or something that's telling you, hey, something's happening here. So it's very important to look at all aspects. No, I think mahalaga yun sa ecologist. If you have an ecological time frame, then you will identify those things. Kasi, di ba, ang ecology is a science of it depends. Bakit ganun? Di ba? And it's just that you're looking at genes now. Anybody else? Comments? Yes.
Ma'am, question lang po when it comes to molecular markers and yung sa mga loci po. Ano po yung general consensus or yung general rule of thumb sa kung ano po yung ginagamit na markers at kasi yung kanina po na percent ng mga loci, may iba't ibang range kung gaano kadami na loci yung ginamit sa studies. Meron po bang general rule of thumb kung ilan yung gagamitin or sino po yung nagde-decide?
Okay. The short answer there is the more the merrier. No, so more markers obviously are ideal, no, because it gives you a lot of data points to explore and to play with, um, uh, and that is not an impossibility when you're doing high throughput sequencing, right? Because off the bat, you get thousands, no, of thousands of markers depending on I guess, the flavor of sequencing that you're doing. But if, for example, for more traditional markers, where it might not be uh, it might be challenging to get more markers. Pa to? Ang naisip ko lang kasi actually are microsatellite markers for those. Kasi for like, for example, for Sanger sequencing, diba? There are I guess key markers that you can choose. So parang meron niyang weight as in bigat. So these markers are more informative, diba, than these ones. For example, um, if your question is, I want to diagnose species. Okay. So there are several go-to markers for that. So you can do control region, or you can do a few nuclear genes and compare the concordance. So it depends on what your organism is and what the available information there is in terms of these are the more informative markers that you might be better off using if this is your question. Thank you. Yes.
There. So parang, di ba, you can narrow down. So marami na masyadong information. So you can, try to screen some if you look at what's already in the data and what has been reported. And maybe you can just target particular areas if you just want to verify or look at related species. So ako lang ang share ko doon. If you look at management, for example, because I look at management and fisheries, so you all know that depends on scale, no? So depende rin yun sa scale ng resolution, no? So I don't know, Raish, no? For example, you said the marine biogeographic regions that were based on descriptions of species composition that done by Perry, no? Like, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago.
1994.
Ganun pa rin siya. It still holds. No, even the first Alzheimer's studies that we looked at north and south, the big brush, ganun pa rin siya. Hindi siya, the big brush pictures, hindi nawawala. No? So if for management, when I talk about, for example, sea cucumbers, it's more than enough to say, hindi isang genetic stock ng Philippines. Iba-iba siya. So you don't mix the stocks, you want to conserve genetic. But if you want to look at selection for aquaculture production, etc., no, and you want to optimize, I think then that's a different question. So again, it depends on what is the application for, no? And what is the range of the species you're talking about. Any more comments? Questions? Yes.
Hello po, ma'am. So, in connection po sa markers and sa biogeographic region. So, kanina po yung presentation is we use the PCA and SNP panels to check yung species and the populations. So, in a smaller scale, for example, in aquaculture farm na po application. For example, in a small group of organisms, merong disease, for example, sa fish na pass on sa certain group lang. So you want to find out if yung yung disease na yon is just on the certain population. Do we also use SNP panels or ano pong methods ang ginagamit pag small scale lang?
Okay. So actually counterintuitive nga siya na when you're actually looking at smaller scales, smaller in terms of biological hierarchy, no? If you're looking at the level of populations, individuals, that's actually when you need more powerful markers. Kasi you really need many markers to identify, this is individual 1, this is individual 2. Okay. But if you were doing, for example, species level, diba? Then very broad conserved markers will work. So so that's the first point. No, when you're trying to interrogate variation at the individual level, you really need to use lots of markers, preferably genome-wide.
For example po, if a disease is passed on, like, pwede po ba siya like for parentage? Do we also use these methods po? Like this?
So if the question is parang you're trying to examine parang disease resistance.
Yes.
Okay. So parang that would fall under the realm of genome-wide association studies, no? Parang trying to map phenotypes, whatever that is. So it can be growth, it can be disease resistance, tolerance to something, etc. Diba? So you will need to really look at genome-wide association studies to be able to explore the genotype phenotype correlations. Okay.
Any more questions? Yeah. No more? So, yeah, so if there's no more, no, we'll thank Dr. Rachel. And kung hiya kayo, may tanong kayo, you can always ask Rachel and the people in her lab. No? So, and I do hope that there will be more Rachels out there in the next generation. I keep telling Rachel, you have to find your other Rachel. I found my Rachel. So there she is. Established her own research program. And I'm sure many of you will be able to do the same wherever you go. No? So please don't hesitate, learn, no? Enjoy the opportunity to learn, okay? From each other. So maraming salamat, Rachel.
Thank you.
Okay. Salamat po sa lahat that attended.
Merienda po sa labas, guys. Dito banda sa cafeteria.